Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. There's a video on YouTube called Why Marxism Cannot Work, and I was asked to make a response to this, so let's take a look.
Karl Marx was a journalist, revolutionary socialist, economist and philosopher born in Germany in 1818. He was a staunch opponent of capitalism and was responsible for developing Marxism, which has formed the basis of some truly overwhelmingly destructive political, social and economic philosophies. The fundamental principle of Marxism is this: the capitalist state is responsible for perpetuating a system that encourages the wealthy upper-middle-class bourgeoisie to exploit the low-wage industrial proletariat in a class war. So Marx maintained that the proletariat must assume socio-economic control through means of dictatorship in order to create a classless and socialist societal order.
I'm unsure if he understands what he's talking about, but let's allow him to proceed.
Our capitalist system is based on the idea that the means of production rests in the hands of private owners, an elite few who control industry, factories, businesses, shops, and corporations. The people who work for these businesses have no say in how they are run and do not share any kind of joint ownership. Marx had a problem with this setup and believed it promoted inequality. Marx was convinced that only a workers' revolution could resolve this conflict and restore some semblance of equality. The result was a system known as communism, in which all means of production and enterprise would be owned by everyone.
He has I think it's a liberation theology symbol. It's a Christian cross and a sickle. How did you find that? Surely if you Google hammer and sickle, it's not going to give you that. Kind of funny.
Marx also believed that modern industrial work was sterile, devoid of meaning and humanity, and alienating to most people. Because capitalism was primarily concerned with generating profits as efficiently as possible, work became highly mechanized and dehumanizing, where specialized assembly line labor required no individuality or personal ingenuity or creativity.
I don't know, everything in this video is so simplistic. Alienation is not specifically about assembly line work or even industrial work. Alienation is about capitalist society as a whole. It's not about, the specific conditions of Marx's day. I assume that this guy has a problem with Marx's theory of alienation, that he doesn't think it's real, but just look at society, look at all these crazy things that people are doing. Clearly there are lots of socially alienated people, people who are chronically depressed, suicidal, there's substance abuse. They don't feel like the society is treating them fairly. They don't feel like they belong to this society in any way. Of course, some societies are more alienated than others. South Korea and Japan, for example, are one of the most alienated societies ever, probably. There's mass suicide, mass depression. People are extremely lonely and can't connect with other people. Marx said that alienation consists of, among other things, workers not being able to connect with other workers. But let's move on.
Therefore, it was easy for workers to become disillusioned with their occupations and concerned that they could be easily replaced and made redundant if economic needs required it. In short, a capitalist system made people feel expendable. The primary gripe Marx had with capitalists was that their profits were in effect a form of theft. They did little to no real work, while their employees generated all of their wealth through arduous labor.
Well, that is a moral argument. Marx's main gripe with capitalism was that it generated absolute misery. So you don't even have to, think about if it's fair or if property is theft or not. It's just a horrible system. It creates absolute poverty, destitution, war, famine, all the horrible things there are, and there's seemingly no way to put an end to them without getting rid of capitalism itself.
This, he believed, was nothing more than exploitation of the labor class. His theories also proposed that capitalism was wasteful and produced overabundance and far more products than we could ever consume.
Well, yes, there is the theory of the crisis of overproduction. It's not so much that it's wasteful or that it creates overabundance. That wouldn't be a problem in itself. It's just that is most of all a problem for capitalism itself, because it's not a social problem. it doesn't really harm the people directly, it just causes capitalism itself to run to crisis. Like, capitalism itself produces crises of capitalism every now and then, and crisis of overproduction is one of those.
Marx saw this as a sign that in a large and efficient industrial economic system, few people genuinely needed to work. This meant that the majority of people could enjoy more leisure time and shouldn't be concerned with the negative connotation associated with being unemployed.
Okay, now it just gets crazy. Like, what? What have you been reading? Like, the stuff previous to this was, you know, simplistic and vulgarized, but at least it was sort of close to the truth. But this? What? People shouldn't be concerned with the negative implications of unemployment? Like, you do understand that in Marxist countries, there has typically been 0% unemployment. Marx wanted everybody to work. Like, what? Where does this come from? What? I don't understand. Where do these people get these ideas?
While a small number of people would toil tirelessly, the masses were free to enjoy their own personal pursuits.
This is just so ridiculous. Marx never said that. What are you talking about? While a small number of people toiled endlessly, everyone else would just be lazy. No, what? How would that ever work? Nobody has ever suggested such a thing, and nobody has certainly ever tried it. Look at all these Marxist countries. Everybody was working. Like, what the
Article 118. Citizens of the USSR have the right to work, that is, are guaranteed the right to employment and payment for their work in accordance with its quantity and quality. The right to work is ensured by the socialist organization of the national economy, the steady growth of the productive forces of Soviet society, the elimination of the possibility of economic crises, and the abolition of unemployment. Constitution, fundamental law, of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
This sounds all wonderful and utopian in theory.
No, it doesn't. That sounds fucking dumb. What are you talking about?
The problem is, the system is even less fair than the capitalist system Marx criticized.
God. I mean, fuck. This is one of those things that I've been thinking about. Like, why, when people make anti-communist videos, why do they have to come up with these, like, ridiculous strawman arguments? Like, surely there would be actual things you could criticize about socialism or communism or Marxism. Like, why do you have to invent things that Marx never said? I don't get it. Where the hell does this idea come from? I've never heard this before.
This is because it states that those who contribute the most to society, work the hardest, and provide the most ingenuity are no different to those who contribute the least and hardly work at all.
Citizens of the USSR have the right to work, that is, are guaranteed the right to employment and payment for their work in accordance with its quantity and quality.
Payment for their work in accordance with its quantity and quality.
I'm trying to, like, figure out where he gets this shit, because this is certainly not what Marx was saying. It's basically like a detective story, like a mystery, when you watch an anti-communist video. Because they have no sources, typically, and then they just say insane shit and claim that Marx or Lenin or somebody supposedly argued this or said this, and then there's never any quotes and never any sources. It's the same with this. There's no source for anything. All it is just a bunch of social media links. There's no source, and there's no quotes. Nothing. He just says, like, this is supposedly what Marxism is all about. What a fucking joke.
It also created societal and cultural stagnation.
Then he just, like, says in one sentence, like, oh yeah, it also caused social and cultural stagnation. No need to explain further. No need to provide any evidence. What? What kind of social and cultural stagnation did Marxism cause? Marxism has caused incredible social progress and development, industrial development, quite literal human development, people learning how to read, people receiving healthcare, scientific development like the invention of satellites and spaceships and all kinds of cool things, invention of new medical technology, invention of new ways of producing energy, producing products, not to mention like cultural development like literature, classical music, movies, high culture, popular culture, like everything that was produced in socialist countries. Like, what are you talking about? What kind of stagnation did it cause?
Marx also believed that marriage, a fundamental supporting structure of civilization, was oppressive to women and little more than an economic arrangement and a means by which the state exploited men and women. It's not hard to see how movements like feminism have their roots in Marxist doctrine.
Alright, so he is kinda right in the sense that, of course, Marxism is connected to feminism in the sense that Marxism wants equal rights for everybody. Bourgeois feminists, of course, they were not really so much concerned with things that impact all women, they were more concerned with things that impact mostly wealthy women, or they were just coming at feminism from such a bourgeois and capitalist viewpoint that they could have never really achieved actual equality, even if their demands were met. Surely as a woman in the 1800s, you are oppressed by the men, surely, but I would argue that it's still a bigger inequality in society if you are a female worker versus a bourgeois lady, you know? And even in today's society, this is like one of my gripes with ID poll. You can be whatever ethnic, sexual or gender minority, but if you just have tons of money, like if you're rich, it doesn't really matter. Like Caitlyn Jenner or anybody who is of some oppressed group, allegedly, but they just have tons of money, it doesn't matter. Like, you think Lil Wayne is really oppressed because he's black? Nah, at a certain point you just have so much money that it doesn't really matter anymore. Bourgeois feminism, they might want nominal equality between men and women, but if they don't fix the inequality between worker and capitalist, then it's kinda minimal. And okay, marriage. I mean, first of all, Marx himself did get married. Whatever, like, what Marx actually said, it says in the Communist Manifesto that abolition of private property must bring forth an abolition of the current system, and it calls the current system prostitution, both public and private. It is making an exaggeration, a deliberate exaggeration, but it basically says that, yeah, there's actual prostitution, but how is this system where some, like, rich capitalist gets to marry whoever, because they just have the money, people want to be married to them, and it's a financial agreement. Of course, Marx didn't say that nobody ever marries another person because they love them. Of course that happens, like, as I said, Marx himself did get married, but you can see how money is an influence in capitalist society. Certainly, even more so in the society that Marx was living in.
For more on this, check out my video, Marxist Feminism, Marriage and MGTOW, link below in the description. Marx's beliefs and philosophies weren't taken all that seriously at the time, but there were those who considered them revolutionary and avant-garde and sought to incorporate them into future socio-political structures.
Well, he says that Marx's ideas weren't taken too serious at the time. Well, certainly they weren't as influential as they became later on, but it's kind of relative what is taken seriously and what is not. Certainly Marx was a major thinker in his time. The Communist League specifically wanted to meet with Marx and Engels and asked Marx and Engels to write their founding document, you know, the Communist Manifesto. Not their founding document, well, kind of their statement of principles, because the group had existed before, but in the new form, they wanted Marx and Engels to join it and basically give them ideological guidance. Marx was thought to be, and his ideas were thought to be so dangerous that that's why he was kicked out of so many countries and he was in exile.
The cataclysmic failures of experimental socialist projects and communist regimes that followed provided unequivocal evidence that Marxist principles could only be sustained through planned economies, dictatorships, and oppression of the masses.
Okay, now it just gets even worse. Okay, I don't get the part where he says that Marx's ideas can only be sustained by planned economy. Like, yeah, what's wrong with that? Planned economy, yes. And then he says, like, oppression and whatnot. This guy, clearly he doesn't know anything. The biggest thing that annoys me with anti-communism is that you don't really have to know anything. Like, you don't actually have to read any books, or you don't actually have to too deeply research anything. You could just go on, like, Wikipedia or something, and it gives you the Cold War propaganda, and as the source it has, like, Robert Conquest and the Black Book of Communism and stuff, and you can just read that, and then you can just repeat that. And because that's so prevalent in society, that kind of propaganda has been fed to people for such a long time that it's absolutely prevalent in society, so you could just say pretty much anything along those lines, and nobody will ever question you, and you don't have to prove anything. And look at this video, like, half the things he says are not even remotely true, but he just gets away with it. On the other hand, if I'm making a response, I have to prove everything I'm saying, otherwise people will be extremely skeptical of what I'm saying, even if they are entirely true. But yeah, he says that Marxist societies have been oppressive and they could only be sustained because of oppression. But why do you think there's such a thing as the police force, for instance? You don't think that unless there was a certain level of oppression, capitalist society would just fall apart? Clearly he hasn't thought about this even for 1 second. Why do you think it is so hard to overthrow a capitalist society? Because there's all these oppressive structures. There's propaganda to make people not want to overthrow it. You know, police and military and secret service and massive spying programs and stuff to try to stop you from actually overthrowing it. And then if you do overthrow the capitalist system, then probably a bunch of other capitalist countries will attack you immediately, which is pretty much exactly what happened. You should realize that any class society is going to need some kind of structure to keep the other class from overthrowing it. In a capitalist society, it's the capitalists, the rich people, they will use all these oppressive structures to keep the poor from taking power. You know, if the police would go away, you know what would happen instantly? Well, the poor would just take what they need and they wouldn't be poor anymore. They would just take what they need. Oh, I'm hungry. Well, I'm just gonna go and take some food because there's tons of it just laying around, but the cops are keeping it from me. Whereas in a socialist society, the workers have their own institutions to keep the capitalists and their running dogs from taking over and restoring capitalist exploitation.
The reason socialism is fundamentally flawed is that it destroys the meritocracy and fails to reward human endeavor and hard work.
This is such a bizarre argument, because clearly this has never happened. Because he is implying that nobody worked hard under socialism. This is such a bizarre argument. What makes you think that? The Soviet Union, they achieved so many great things and they worked incredibly hard. They were motivated. If you interview, there's documentaries. Actually, I'm gonna play a couple of clips right now.
Some had come because they had no choice. They needed work, but others came, I mean this, with a burning enthusiasm, wanting to take part. My roommate was a young Russian called Kolya. We had the best room in the barrack because he was the foreman on my shift. His enthusiasm, right from the first day I arrived, it was infectious.
I mean, where you come from, they build big. Yes?
Yes.
American iron and steel, biggest in the world, yes?
Yeah.
Yes, well, here we'll build bigger. Except the difference is, in America, who takes the profit?
The bosses.
Capitalist parasites, What I build for myself. Every rivet in this plant, we all have a share.
To produce engineers and technicians for the new society, training was expanded. And the communists said women should have equality with men, with equal pay. Illiteracy was one of a new generation of women.
Когда Ленин сказал, стране нужна электрификация, а коммунизм это советская...
When Lenin said that communism is Soviet power plus electrification, I decided that I should become an electrical engineer, that was my holy duty. And I didn't want to just draw up plans, I wanted to build an electric power station. That was my mission, and I achieved it. The revolution gave me the right to feel equal to any man. It gave me the right to work, to study what I wanted to study. We live so well. Our hearts are so joyful. In no other country are there such happy young people as us. We're the happiest young people. And on behalf of all young people, I want to thank our party and our dear comrade Stalin for this joy that we have. Stalin set a task. Build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness. wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible at one of the most difficult times to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. Because for us, Stalin was an idol.
Teams of young activists were sent to the country.
We went from house to house in search of illiterate people. We made a note of their names. We then found suitable rooms to hold classes in.
Learning to write would open new doors for those trapped at the bottom of society. One woman who couldn't attend classes because of her child at home was helped by Anastasia Denisova.
Я сказала, что вот тебе учебник, вот будешь заниматься.
I said, here's a textbook for you. I'll come to you so you can learn to read at home. I remember vividly that when the baby cried, she carried on writing with one hand while she rocked him with the other. She was so keen to study. I'll always remember her striving for knowledge and enlightenment. It was immense.
It was a factory that made machinery for mines. I enjoyed my work. All my life I've operated cranes. I've never done anything different. I cry when I think about the past. Life was beautiful. I could go anywhere. My holidays were paid for. Plane tickets weren't expensive. Before, with 1 ruble, you could get 2 meals at the factory cafeteria. I would be so happy if we could go back to the USSR.
There's people who remember what it was like, and they were extremely motivated, sometimes by monetary incentives and, upward mobility in society, which was provided by socialism, not by capitalism, but also by other things. They just thought it was important to improve society. Like, this guy is such an idiot.
Suppresses and disincentivizes innovation and attempts to keep the best and brightest down to the level of the lowest common denominator.
Again, more baseless nonsense. The Soviet Union put the first man in space, for Christ's sake. And you don't think they can innovate at all? It's like in that Steven Crowder video when me and Raven and Hammer and Sickle, we were responding to something Steven Crowder said, and I think Steven Crowder said that socialist countries were bad at innovating, but they were just randomly good at making weapons and space technology. Like, that's not how it works. Like, you're not an idiot at technology and then randomly just an absolute genius at a couple of areas of technology. I don't know what Crowder was expecting them to be making, but they focused on making weapons to defend themselves, and they focused on making spaceships, and then they made a bunch of nice innovations in those fields. But, of course they made other things like nuclear reactors. Like I said in a different video that they sold electric locomotives and things like that to Finland, and also nuclear reactors to Finland. So, I mean, they made plenty of innovations, and in every field. Industry, medicine, music, whatnot. Like, even film. They made such fundamental innovations. Like, the film technique of montage was invented by a Soviet director.
Free trade capitalist societies may not be perfect or even fully stable at times, hence the reason their economic collapses are so utterly devastating. But they do lift people from poverty and promote more freedom and personal economic prosperity. Just ask yourself, which country would you rather live in? North Korea or South Korea?
Well, okay. So he says that capitalism lifts more people out of poverty. Well, you look at the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire existed for a pretty fucking long time. When was the part where they improved people's lives? Like, never. It just was always shitty. Was always bad. The average life expectancy was 30 years. 20% of the population could read. So basically just the rich people and their helpers, like the administrators and stuff, could read. Then when the Soviet Union emerges, they doubled the life expectancy. So clearly they are lifting people from misery. Or look at China. When was the time in capitalist China where upward social mobility happened? It didn't really happen. It was always bad. Again, life expectancy was 30 years. It was even worse than it was in Russia. And then, okay, the communists take over. Life expectancy is doubled. Illiteracy is eliminated. Massive improvement in everything. Look at all the countries on the planet. The vast majority of countries are capitalist, and nearly all of them are absolutely poor. Like, the only capitalist countries where people are relatively wealthy are in Western Europe and North America. Okay, then there's some mid-tier countries like in other parts of Europe. Some parts of South America aren't as bad as other parts of South America. Of course, like North Africa is better than the rest of Africa, but the majority of Africa, India, Asia, South America, Eastern Europe, like, it's pretty damn bad. And it's capitalist. And he mentions democracy. Where was the democracy in Russia until the communists took over? There was none. Where was the democracy in China before the communists took over? There was none. Then he just, like, takes one country and looks at it in a vacuum. He's like, North Korea versus South Korea. Well, okay. North Korea was bombed to absolute shit, yet they still managed to, achieve a pretty good standard of living afterwards, even though not only were they bombed and attacked by the United States, they didn't even, the US couldn't even conquer them, even though they tried. Okay, so they managed to get a relatively good standard of living even after that, like, even though they started as a Japanese colony and then they were bombed by the US, and then ever since then there's been crushing economic sanctions against them. It's like, don't you think that this is just a slightly unfair comparison? North Korea has, like, the harshest economic sanctions against it in the history of economic sanctions. The US are constantly trying to think of, like, how can we make these sanctions harsher, but there just aren't that many ways left because they are pretty much at the maximum level of sanctions. They're absolutely economically blockaded. Whereas South Korea, it's the opposite. South Korea gets investment from the West. South Korea has American troops on its soil, occupying it. Of course, the US says that they're there to defend them or help them or something, but they're occupying the country. Whereas North Korea has to use its few resources to massively boost up its defensive capabilities because the US is, like, on the other side of the border, flying B-52 bombers with nukes in them, like, on the other side of the border. So I think this is a pretty unfair comparison. Not to mention, life is not too great for a bunch of people in South Korea. Like, yeah, South Korea has rich people in it, and South Korea does have a middle class. At this point, it didn't used to. Like, fairly recently, now that the US has been starting to, like, give them massive amounts of money, they have developed a middle class. But North Koreans still have many things that South Koreans don't have that are good. North Korea has free education, free healthcare. It is a much less socially alienated. We were talking about alienation before. There is not a suicide epidemic in North Korea like there is in South Korea. If South Korea is so great, then why do so many people who choose to leave North Korea because of the poorer economic conditions? A lot of people leave North Korea because they're so scared the US is gonna, like, nuke them or something. Or because they think that, oh, the South Korea doesn't have sanctions, they got lots of money, let's go there. Then they go there, and they see that it's horrible, and they go back. Why do you think they go back? Because South Korean culture is alienating, anti-human, and because there was the tragic story, I'll put the link in the description, but the tragic story of this woman who went to South Korea, and they had a medical condition, and they were absolutely devastated that, like, what? South Korea doesn't have free healthcare? Like, you can just die? You're sick and you'll just die? They'll just leave you to die alone? Like, what is this absolute nightmare? And, yeah, that's what it's like. People have a tendency of thinking that the grass is always greener in some other place. South Korea has shanty towns. Like, that's absurd. North Korea doesn't have shanty towns. Like, South Korea has shanty towns and slums. Like, have you seen the slums in Pyongyang? They don't exist. And the countryside in South Korea is even worse. So, yeah, North Korea has less money because they have to put so much of it into defensive spending, and also because there's sanctions against them and all that. They don't have as much trade as they would like to have. But at least they're fair. Like, social equality goes a long way. Like, if you share what little you have, it goes a long way. What's the point of having lots of money when you still have slums and like crazy amounts of homeless people and people who die because they can't get healthcare? Like, what's the point? Rich people can be well off, like nice. I don't think this is a good argument.
Socialism requires a totalitarian level of government intervention to regulate every aspect of society. Capitalism does not. The historic record of Marxist philosophies is clear. They do not work and merely produce the highest levels of autocracy, censorship, social unrest, poverty, and starvation on the planet.
Social unrest? When was this crazy social unrest? Like, do you mean the Cultural Revolution? That's like the only thing I can think of. So, well, excuse us for putting people in control. Well, my bad. Starvation? Implying capitalist Russia didn't have famines constantly, implying capitalist China didn't have famines constantly until these dirty commies showed up and put an end to the famines. Like, implying capitalist Africa isn't chronically starving all the time. Like, you know, there was a time when this small, underdeveloped African country, which used to be a colony of a capitalist country, it used to be a colony of the French. It was a small, starving, undeveloped country. One of the poorest in Africa, in fact. It was called the Republic of Upper Volta. And then this communist, this Marxist guy, named Thomas Sankara came to power in this shitty, small, like, starving African country. And they changed the name of the country to Burkina Faso. And he was in power for 4 years until the French had a guy assassinate him and restore the old order. But during this 4-year period, Burkina Faso actually became food self-sufficient. So don't give me this shit about famine and starvation. It's precisely because of capitalism that these countries are starving still. There's more food than there's people who eat the food. There is more than enough food. It is a question of distribution, and it is a question of profit and what makes sense for the capitalists. If this underdeveloped, starving African country can become food self-sufficient in a meager 4 years, then that kind of makes you think, like, why is Africa and why are all these other places still starving? It is not because of some kind of necessary law of nature, like Africa must always starve. No. It is a question of politics. And under capitalism, these issues can never be solved. This guy, he claims that Marxism is a historical failure, that it just collapsed to its own impossibility. But that just demonstrates his own ignorance. There was a Cold War where the capitalist countries allied together to destroy the socialist countries, and finally they succeeded. Through military intervention, military arms race, economic blockade, propaganda war, and everything else. They finally succeeded for the most part. Of course, there's still like some remnants of the socialist world left. Socialism was such a historical success that all these socialist countries, China, Russia, whatnot, they used to be incredibly poor third world countries who nobody really cared about. People laughed at them. Then when they became socialist, suddenly they became world superpowers. That doesn't imply success to you. The Soviet Union, after the Second World War, emerged as a more powerful country economically and militarily than almost all the previous capitalist superpowers. It emerged as more powerful than France, more powerful than Germany, the UK, Japan, all these other major capitalist players. The success of socialism was so immense that the imperialists, the capitalists, they stopped caring about inter-imperialist rivalry. Remember the First World War, when it was two major capitalist alliances against each other, like the Turks and the Japanese and the Russians and the French and the Germans and the British and the Americans all killing each other, trying to steal each other's things? And then the Second World War, when it was Germany and Italy and Japan and Spain versus the UK and France and Poland and the US, and then the Soviet Union was one player in that war. That all changed. The capitalists, they were like, all they cared about after that was the Soviet Union. They're like, yeah, who the fuck cares about what Japan wants to do? Who cares what the UK wants to do or what the French want to do? We care about what the Soviets want to do. Like, it's now one massive alliance of every capitalist country versus the Soviet Union and the countries allied to that. Soviet Union was seen as the biggest threat to imperialist world hegemony. Like, isn't that a strange situation? Like, historically, the British have always been concerned about the French. Like, they've been competing with the French. And the US has always been competing with European powers and with Japan. Not anymore with the Soviet Union. They were like, yeah, we can work with these European powers. The Soviet Union, that's like really the biggest competitor. So, if socialism is so unsuccessful, then how could it even compete with capitalism the way it did? I smell something fishy about your argument. It's almost as if you don't know what you're actually talking about.